Sheriff's office!
Sheriff's office!
We're gonna go in here and sit down, okay? Yep.
Oh, God.
We're gonna go in here and sit down, okay?
Hey, buddy. Hey.
Please. Please, God. Please.
Some 911 calls sound like grief. Some 911 calls sound like panic. Like shattered glass and swallowed air and a voice that cannot quite hold itself together. But experienced investigators know something that most people don't. Grief and performance can look almost identical from the outside. On a warm June night in Coweta County, Georgia in 2021, a woman named Cheryl Coe made a call to emergency services. She was screaming. She was sobbing. She was begging for someone to save her husband. Her husband, Luther Coe III, was 48 years old. He was a father, a partner, a man who still had decades left ahead of him. When sheriff's deputies arrived at the home, they found Luther lying on the floor. There was a gunshot wound to his body. His wife was kneeling beside him, holding him, her cries piercing through the night air and into the ears of every officer on scene. She told them she had been terrified. She told them an intruder had broken in. She told them it was an accident. But over the next several hours, across a series of conversations that grew longer, quieter, and far more revealing, a different story began to surface. And at the center of it was a marriage, a secret, a weapon, and 2 shots fired in the dark. This is the story of what happened in Coweta County, Georgia. This is the story of Luther Coe III. And this is the story of the night Cheryl Coe pulled the trigger. Most tragedies begin on ordinary nights. No warnings, no dramatic music, no signs that the world is about to shift on its axis. June in Coweta County, Georgia is thick with summer heat, the kind that lingers even after sunset, the kind that seeps through screen doors and settles into the walls of a house like something that has always lived there. Coweta County sits about 40 miles southwest of Atlanta. It is a community of small towns and rural stretches. Neighborhoods where people know their neighbors, where lights go off early and front porches stay quiet past 9. The Coe family lived in one of those neighborhoods. To anyone passing by, it was a home like any other, a house that held history inside its walls. Years of shared meals, conversations, arguments, the 1,000 small moments that build a marriage over time. Luther Coe III was 48 years old in June of 2021. He was by many accounts a man who filled up the room he walked into. Someone with a presence, someone with opinions and energy, and the kind of personality that you remember long after the conversation ends. His wife Cheryl Coe was 51 years old, 3 years his senior. They had been together long enough for the relationship to have its own language, its own rhythms, its own specific set of tensions. Like many marriages that have endured long enough, the Coe marriage had cracks in it. But on the surface, on an ordinary Tuesday night in June, those cracks were not visible to anyone standing outside their front door. The house was quiet. The neighbors were asleep. The night was the kind of night where nothing is supposed to happen. And then a gun went off. And then the screaming started. And nothing in Coweta County was quiet anymore. Every story has a turning point. A moment where the path could have gone a different direction. A moment where if one single decision had been made differently, everyone involved might have woken up the next morning and never known what almost happened. In the Coe household, that moment had roots far deeper than a single night. The trouble did not begin in June of 2021. The trouble had been building for months, maybe longer. By the time that summer arrived, Luther and Cheryl Coe were a couple living inside a fundamental disagreement about what their marriage was supposed to be. Luther had been pushing for something Cheryl did not want. He wanted to open the relationship. In the world of relationship psychology, this is called an open marriage, a structure in which both partners agree to pursue romantic or physical connections outside of the primary partnership. Some couples navigate this successfully, with communication, with boundaries, with genuine mutual consent. But the key word is mutual. Cheryl did not agree. According to her own account, Luther had been persistent about this. He wanted to bring other people into their relationship. She did not. And that disagreement had created a fault line running through the center of their home. Now, this is important. Disagreement inside a marriage is not a crime. Couples fight, couples argue, couples navigate difficult conversations about compatibility and desire and the direction they want their lives to go. But what happens in that space between disagreement and resolution matters enormously. What happens when the argument does not resolve? What happens when the pressure keeps building? What happens when someone reaches for something they never should have reached for? On the night of the shooting, Luther and Cheryl Coe were not strangers sharing a house. They were two people who had been circling the same unresolved conflict for a long time. And whatever happened between them in those final hours of Luther's life, it did not begin that evening. It had already been in motion for a long time. That is the first wrong decision in this story, not the pulling of a trigger. The decision to let something fester rather than face it. The decision to keep living inside a tension that had no outlet and no resolution. By June of 2021, that tension had reached its limit. And on one warm summer night, it broke. It happened fast. That is one thing that is consistent across nearly every account of gun violence in domestic settings. The violence itself is almost always brief. A few seconds, a decision made in a fraction of a moment, and then the consequences that last forever. In the bedroom of the Coe home, the night collapsed into itself. Luther Coe came into that bedroom. He was not calm. According to Cheryl's account given later, Luther had entered the room in a state of extreme agitation. He was yelling, he was moving aggressively. He grabbed her, he pulled her from the bed. There was a gun on the nightstand, Cheryl's gun, her firearm, a weapon she kept close. She reached for it, and she fired. 2 shots. Luther Coe was struck. The bullet entered his body at close range, extremely close range. He went down, and for a few seconds, maybe more, the room held the kind of silence that only exists after something irreversible has happened. Then Cheryl's voice came back. She called 911, and everything that would happen next would depend entirely on whether the story she told that night was the truth or whether it was the most important lie of her life. The first deputies arrived quickly. In Coweta County, response times to emergency calls are taken seriously. The department has resources, it has training, and when a 911 call comes in reporting a shooting, officers move fast. When they came through the door, they found Cheryl Coe on the floor. She was holding Luther. He was alive, barely, a single gunshot wound to the body. Blood. His breathing was labored. His eyes may have still been open. It was the kind of scene that hits officers hard, even when they have seen scenes like it before. Cheryl was screaming, "Save him! Please, save my husband." Her distress was immediate and total. She was physically clinging to Luther as deputies tried to assess the situation. She was not composed, she was not detached. She appeared to be a woman watching her husband die in front of her. Emergency medical personnel were called. Luther was attended to. Cheryl was guided away from the immediate area so that officers could begin to piece together what had happened. And that is when the first version of the story was told. She had been asleep. She heard a sound, a voice, something that terrified her. She thought an intruder had entered the house. She grabbed the guns from the nightstand. She fired 2 shots into the dark. And only then did she realize it was Luther. It was a story designed to produce a particular reaction. Tragic accident, horrified wife, darkness and confusion and the terror of someone who believed she was about to be attacked. Officers listened. They took it in. They asked follow-up questions. But even in those early minutes before any forensic evidence had been examined, before any interrogation room conversations had taken place, before the investigation had even fully begun, at least one officer on scene felt something was off. He did not say it loudly. He did not accuse anyone, but he noticed something. The details did not quite line up. The next few hours would determine whether that instinct was right. There is a specific psychology to the interrogation room. It is not what you see in the movies. It is not always aggressive. It is not always loud. The most effective interrogations are often the ones that feel like conversations, where the investigator builds something that resembles trust, where the subject begins to relax, where the story starts to unravel, not because someone was broken down, but because they forgot to keep track of what they had already said. Cheryl Coe was brought into that space. She was upset. Anyone watching her would have seen a woman in distress. Her eyes were red. Her voice broke when she spoke. She expressed love for Luther. She expressed fear. She expressed bewilderment. The investigators were patient. They asked her to take them through the night, from the beginning, step by step. She had been asleep. She heard something. She reacted. The investigators nodded. They asked clarifying questions. Where exactly was the gun? Which direction was she facing? How dark was the room? Cheryl answered. And then carefully, one of the investigators shifted the line of questioning. They asked about the marriage, not accusatorially, not as a gotcha, just as a natural part of understanding the context of the household. How were things between you and Luther? Was everything okay? And here is where the first fracture appeared. Cheryl paused. When someone is telling a practiced lie, the unexpected question often creates a visible hesitation. Not because the person is incapable of lying further, but because the new question was not part of the script they had prepared. Things had not been okay, Cheryl admitted. There had been tension in the marriage, and the tension had a specific source. She told investigators about the open marriage disagreement. Luther wanted it. She did not. It had been an ongoing conflict, something that had been causing significant friction between them. The investigators continued to listen. They took notes. They asked follow-up questions. They kept their tone measured and calm. But inside that room, the shape of the story had already begun to change. Because a woman who woke from a dead sleep and accidentally shot an intruder who turned out to be her husband does not need to explain marital conflict. A woman who had a very specific, very personal reason to be angry at her husband does. The investigators knew they were not finished yet, and so they kept going. Confessions rarely arrive all at once. That is one of the most important things to understand about criminal interrogations. The full truth almost never comes out in a single moment of honesty. Instead, it comes in layers. Each layer slightly closer to what actually happened. Each concession slightly larger than the one before. And the investigator's job is to follow those layers. With Cheryl Coe, the layers came across multiple conversations. Some at the scene, some in the interrogation room, some in the pauses between questions. The first story, the intruder story, began to erode almost immediately. By the time investigators pressed her on the specifics, Cheryl had already introduced the marital conflict into the conversation. And once that door was open, it was impossible to close. In a later account, significantly different from the first, Cheryl described what actually happened in the bedroom. Luther had come into the room. He was not a mysterious, dark figure she had mistaken for a stranger. He was her husband. He came in upset. He was yelling. He was physical. He grabbed her. He pulled her off the bed. She reached for the gun. She said she was trying to warn him off, to scare him, to stop him from hurting her. She fired 2 shots. One of those shots found its mark. Now, this second account raised a different set of questions entirely. Because if this was the truth, then the narrative shifted from accidental tragedy to something far more legally complex. Was Cheryl acting in self-defense? Was Luther the aggressor? Or was there more to the moment than the story of a frightened wife grabbing a gun to protect herself? Cheryl did not offer a clean answer. She held onto the language of fear. She kept describing herself as terrified, overwhelmed, reacting rather than acting. But the investigators had something she did not know they had. They had the body. And the body told a story that words could not fully revise. Luther Coe had been shot at contact range. Not across a room, not from a distance. The muzzle of the gun had been extremely close to his body when it fired. That is not the profile of a warning shot fired into the dark. That is the profile of something very different. And in the space between what Cheryl said and what the forensic evidence showed, the truth was already taking shape. Modern criminal investigation is not solved in an interrogation room. The interrogation room is where investigators gather narrative, but the truth is assembled from a physical evidence, from science, from the quiet language of a crime scene that has no reason to lie. The investigation into Luther Coe's death involves several interconnected layers. The first was the crime scene itself. Investigators processed the bedroom carefully. They documented the position of the body, the position of the gun, the trajectory of the shots, the physical damage left behind, the location of shell casings, the angle of entry wounds, the presence or absence of defensive marks on Luther's body. All of it cataloged. What they found raised serious questions about the timeline and positioning Cheryl had described. For a woman firing blindly into a dark room at a perceived intruder, the shooting would most likely produce a different physical profile. Casings at a distance, a wound consistent with someone firing from across a room, a scatter pattern. That was not what was found. The wound on Luther's body was consistent with contact range, meaning the gun had been held extremely close to him when fired. Close enough to tell investigators that this was not a blind shot into the darkness. This was a shot fired at a specific person from a very close distance. The second layer of investigation involved the history of the household. Investigators spoke with people who knew the Coes, neighbors, associates, family members. They built a picture of the marriage over time. The conflict over the open relationship arrangement was not a secret that Cheryl had been keeping from everyone. People who were close to the couple were aware that there had been serious disagreement. The pattern of a deteriorating relationship with no clear path to resolution began to emerge. The third layer was Cheryl's own changing statements. In criminal cases, the evolution of a suspect's story is itself a form of evidence. When a person's account changes significantly across multiple tellings, investigators note exactly where the changes occur and what triggered them. The original intruder story versus the physical confrontation story was a significant shift. And that shift had come not from new information, but from the pressure of specific questions. Questions about the marriage, questions about the gun, questions about what the body could tell. By the time all three investigative layers had been assembled, the Coweta County Sheriff's Office had enough to move forward. The conclusion was not that Luther Coe had been shot by a terrified woman who mistook him for an intruder. The conclusion was something much more deliberate, and that conclusion would be placed before a jury. The courtroom is where the story becomes official. Everything that was discovered, everything that was documented, every statement Cheryl Coe made, every inconsistency, every piece of physical evidence recovered from the bedroom. It all came together inside a Georgia courtroom. The prosecution built its case around three central pillars. The first was motive. The ongoing conflict over the open marriage arrangement gave Cheryl a reason to be angry at Luther. Not a justification, not a defense, but a motive, a documented, verifiable source of deep personal resentment. The second was physical evidence. The contact range wound on Luther's body directly contradicted the original story of an accidental discharge fired into a dark room at a perceived threat. You can accidentally fire a gun in a blind panic and have the muzzle end up pressed against another person's body. The physics do not support it. The third was Cheryl's own words. Her testimony over the course of the evening had evolved in ways that tracked perfectly with what the evidence showed. Each time she was presented with a contradiction, her story shifted. And each shift moved it further from the innocent widow narrative and closer to the truth. The defense attempted to argue that Cheryl had acted in self-defense, that Luther had been the aggressor, that he had grabbed her, that she had been in genuine fear for her safety, that the shooting, whatever its circumstances, was the act of a woman trying to protect herself from harm. Self-defense is a legitimate legal argument. It is recognized under Georgia law, and in domestic settings, it is a defense that courts take seriously. But self-defense has specific requirements. The threat must be imminent. The response must be proportional. The use of lethal force must be reasonably necessary to prevent serious bodily harm or death. The jury looked at the evidence. They looked at the contact range wound. They looked at the changing statements. They looked at the marital conflict and what it revealed about the emotional environment inside that house. And they returned a verdict: guilty, murder. Cheryl Coe was convicted of murder in the death of her husband, Luther Coe III. The sentence was the most severe available under Georgia law for this charge: life in prison, without the possibility of parole. She would not see the outside of a correctional facility again. That was the judgment of the court. That was the conclusion of the official record. But the legal verdict, as definitive as it is, does not answer every question this case raises. Because some of the most important questions are not legal questions at all. This is where the story gets genuinely complex. Not in a way that excuses what happened, not in a way that rewrites the verdict or challenges the evidence, but in a way that demands we actually think about what we are watching when we watch an interrogation unfold. Because what happened in that room with Cheryl Coe is a case study in how the human mind behaves when it is caught between survival and guilt. Let's start with the original story, the intruder narrative. Why would someone manufacture a story like that? On the surface, it seems almost naively simple. Anyone who has ever watched a true crime documentary knows that claiming a mysterious intruder is one of the oldest deflections in the history of criminal lying. Scott Peterson, Susan Smith, Casey Anthony. The phantom stranger is a story people tell when they need an explanation for something they did. But here is what forensic psychologists will tell you. People in extreme stress do not always choose clever lies. They choose fast ones. The intruder story requires almost no creative construction. It requires only the insertion of a fictional external threat into an otherwise accurate account of events. Everything else in the scene is real. The bedroom, the gun, the shot, the chaos. All Cheryl had to do was replace Luther with a stranger. That is a cognitively simple edit to make. And when someone is in the moments immediately following a violent act, their brain is not running its highest order reasoning. It is running its most basic survival programs. How do I not get in trouble for this? The simplest available answer was there was someone else here. Now watch what happens when the interrogation begins. Investigators ask about the marriage, a question that is on the surface routine. But it is not routine. It is a deliberately placed probe, because the investigators want to know whether there was a relational context that could explain what happened. And the moment Cheryl answers honestly about the open marriage conflict, she has done something she cannot undo. She has introduced a motive into the official record. Now here is the psychology that matters. People who are genuinely grieving the unexpected loss of a loved one do not typically volunteer information about the relationship's problems without prompting. The emotional experience of sudden, shocking grief tends to produce idealization. People remember the good. They reach for the best version of the person they lost. But people who are carrying guilt alongside grief behave differently. They hedge. They acknowledge complexity. They introduce the negative details in a way that even if they don't realize it, begins to construct a narrative of justification. The open marriage conflict was not just information. It was Cheryl beginning to build a story in which what she did could be understood. Not excused, understood. That is a profoundly different psychological posture than pure grief. Then the story changes again. Luther came in yelling. Luther grabbed her. Luther pulled her from the bed. This is a significant shift. And notice what it does. It converts Luther from a passive background figure, the beloved husband whose loss the widow mourns, into an active aggressor, into a threat, into the proximate cause of his own death. Investigators trained in behavioral analysis call this a narrative justification loop. The subject revises the story not just to explain what happened, but to establish that the other person brought it upon themselves. This is not unique to Cheryl Coe. This pattern appears in case after case after case. The person who pulled the trigger becomes the secondary actor. The victim becomes the initiating force. And suddenly the story is not about what the suspect did, it is about what they had no choice but to do. The contact range wound broke that loop, because no matter how the narrative is constructed, no matter how many times Luther is described as the aggressor, the physical evidence places the gun against his body at the moment of discharge. And that is a detail that no amount of psychological revision can explain away. The interrogation of Cheryl Coe is a masterclass in watching someone try to out-narrate the truth, and a reminder that the truth in the end is not a narrative at all. It is a wound at contact range. It is evidence that cannot be changed by the story told around it. We need to stop here, because it is very easy in a case like this one to become so absorbed in the mechanics of the investigation that you lose sight of something essential. A man died. Luther Coe III was 48 years old when he was killed in June of 2021. 48 years old is not old. It is a midpoint. It is a place in a life where the best chapters may still be waiting to be written, where there is still time to make things right, to change direction, to become something different from what you have been. Luther does not get those chapters. Whatever his flaws were, and no human being lives without them, he did not deserve to die in his own bedroom at the hands of his wife. We know some things about Luther from what has been shared publicly. We know he was a man with presence, with energy, with a personality that made an impression. We know he was someone's husband, potentially someone's father, definitely someone's son, someone's friend. We know that in the last months of his life, he was pushing for something in his marriage that his wife did not want. Whether that behavior was controlling or coercive or simply misguided, we cannot say with certainty. The full texture of their private life is known only to the people who lived it. What we can say is that he was a human being, three-dimensional, complicated, real. In true crime storytelling, there is a constant risk of reducing victims to their final moments, to make them nothing more than the wound through which the story enters. Luther Coe deserves more than that. He deserves to be remembered as someone who existed fully before that night, who had history, who had relationships, who had dreams and frustrations and ordinary Tuesday evenings where nothing particularly important happened. He deserved to grow old. He did not get that. And no verdict, no sentence, no documentary about the investigation that followed his death changes that fundamental fact. Luther Coe III is gone. What remains is the record of what happened to him, and the obligation we have as people who witness these stories to hold on to the reality of who he was. Not a prop, not a statistic, a person. Every criminal case is also a social document. It tells us something about the world outside the courtroom, something about the forces and failures and gaps that allowed a tragedy to arrive at its conclusion. The Coe case teaches several things worth sitting with. The first is about conflict resolution inside intimate relationships. The conflict at the center of this marriage, the disagreement about the open relationship, was not inherently unsolvable. Couples navigate profound incompatibilities every day. They seek counseling. They renegotiate. They make decisions to separate before that incompatibility becomes something worse. But those pathways require specific things to be in place. They require both parties to have access to support, to feel safe enough to seek it, to believe that there is a way through without catastrophe. When those pathways don't exist or when people don't believe they exist, pressure has nowhere to go. The second thing this case teaches us is about the specific danger inside domestic spaces. Intimate partner violence is one of the most under-examined categories of violent crime, not because it is rare, but because it happens behind closed doors, in private spaces, between people who have legal and emotional access to each other in ways that strangers do not. The bedroom is supposed to be the safest room in a house. It is also statistically one of the most dangerous. When a weapon is present in that space inside a relationship where unresolved conflict has been allowed to intensify over time, the risk of catastrophic violence increases dramatically. Firearms in the home and intimate partner conflict are a combination that law enforcement, public health experts, and domestic violence researchers have been raising alarms about for decades. This case is one more data point in that long, painful record. The third lesson is about the performance of grief. Cheryl Coe's behavior at the scene. The screaming, the clinging, the visible distress is worth examining, not because grief is itself suspicious, but because it reminds us that emotional display is not the same thing as truth. We are wired as human beings to respond with empathy to visible pain. We are wired to believe someone who is crying. But skilled investigators know that the presence of distress does not guarantee the absence of guilt. Grief and performance can coexist. And learning to look past the surface display, to follow the evidence, to trust the physical record over the emotional performance is a skill that saves lives. It saved the integrity of this case. Without careful, methodical interrogation and forensic work, a woman who shot her husband at contact range might have walked free with a story about an intruder. That is a chilling thought. It should also be a motivating one, because it means that the quality of investigation, the training of officers, the patience of interrogators, and the rigor of forensic science are not abstract bureaucratic values. They are the difference between justice and impunity. And in Coweta County, Georgia, in June of 2021, they made the difference. Some cases feel resolved when the verdict comes in, the jury speaks, the gavel falls, the sentence is announced, and there is a sense, however incomplete, that something has been settled. The Coe case has that kind of resolution on paper. Cheryl Coe was convicted of murder. She was sentenced to life without parole. The state of Georgia made its determination. The legal system reached its conclusion. But resolutions like that do not actually close anything. They formalize it. They put a name on what happened and place it into the permanent record. What they cannot do is answer the questions that live underneath the verdict. What was it like inside that marriage in the months before the shooting? What did those conversations look like? What was the emotional temperature of that house? What would have happened if someone had intervened earlier? If a counselor had been involved? If a trusted person had asked the right question at the right moment? We cannot know. And that unknowing is part of what makes cases like this one so difficult to sit with. Because we want a clean story. We want a clear villain and a clear victim and a clear turning point where someone made a choice that others would not have made. But real life is messier than that. Real life is two people inside a marriage that had stopped working with no one to help them find their way out of it. Real life is a gun kept on a nightstand. Real life is a conversation that escalated into something neither person may have fully anticipated. And real life is a 48-year-old man who died before he should have. Luther Coe is gone. Cheryl Coe will spend the rest of her life inside a prison cell. And somewhere in between those two facts, there is a story about what happens when conflict is allowed to live too long inside the same four walls with a loaded weapon. We watch cases like this one partly out of fascination, partly out of something that resembles the need to understand, to know how people arrive at these moments, to believe perhaps that by understanding them, we can prevent them. Whether we can or not is the question worth carrying out of this story. If you are in a relationship where conflict has become something that feels dangerous, if you are someone who is afraid inside your own home, if you know someone living in that kind of pressure, the resources exist. The hotlines are staffed. The pathways out are there even when they don't feel like they are. Luther Coe did not have to die. And if this story means anything beyond the facts of what happened in Coweta County in June of 2021, it is that. It did not have to end this way. It never does.